Hey there! I'm Chroma, and welcome to part 18 of Making an Abstract Adventure! Welcome back! This time, we have buttons, buttons, and more buttons. So, going into play mode, showing what we've got. So we have a button object here that is going to make use of our moving object script that we made before, in that when we press it, it gets pressed down, it turns green to show that it's pressed, I guess. And then the from the moving object script that we had before, it's activating it to move, in this case, like a door or something out of the way so that we can continue moving in our level. This is just a one type of button. It just gets pressed once, is the only button that needs to be pressed. The most basic type of button, basically. Then here we have a sort of multi-button thing where 3 buttons need to be pressed in order for this thing to activate. Then here we have a timed button where when we press it, it turns yellow. And then after 2 seconds, then it gets unpressed, and in this case, the door gets moved back into being down. And then lastly here, we have a weighted button that only is pressed as long as the player is standing on it. So then here we can switch to our sphere character over here, move all the way down this way, and then we can have one character be pressing on the button for the other character to be able to move through a doorway or whatever. So now we have all of that. So let's go into how it's being made. First of all, these base colors are just completely random, just to be able to differentiate the different types of buttons. When we actually implement these in the game, the buttons will have a style based on the environment that they're in. And then certain things like the time button, there might be some graphic that shows a clock ticking down or something like that to indicate that there's actually a time limit on those. So going over to our buttons. First of all, these doors, by the way, are just our moving platforms as we've had before, except starting off, the moving object script is set to not be enabled, and then the button goes and enables it for it to start moving up, and then the repeat Boolean that we made before, that is set to false, so that when it reaches the top of its only 2 targets that it travels between, then it stops moving because it's at the top. Yeah, you may also notice that we now have a new Boolean here called reverse that we'll get into in a second when we get to our buttons. So now we have 4 types of buttons here: the button single, the multi-button, which has a parent object, and then all the buttons that that need to be activated for it to activate something else as child objects of it. We have the timed button, and then the weighted button. Eventually we could make more types of buttons, but this seems good enough for now. New types of buttons would kind of just be some expansions of these. Anywho, so this button single, it has a script on it called button once, I guess, just because it's a button that gets pressed once and only does something once. It doesn't get unpressed like some of our other buttons do. And then as public variables, it has the objects to activate, which in this case is our moving platform. This is intentionally left as an array in case we wanted to have a button activate multiple moving platforms for some reason. So then we can easily do that. Then we have 2 references to the unpressed and pressed objects that are child. The actual red and green button are just 2 separate images. So we have this red button, this gets disabled, and then our pressed object gets enabled. Then we have our green button here. Now in this case, yes, we could just move the red button down and change its material for green, but that's something that would only be temporary. Eventually, the actual models for it being pressed and being unpressed, or the sprites, could look very different just depending on how we use them in the game. So that's why I'm just leaving them as being 2 separate objects. Yeah, eventually it might also just be that it is one object, and we just play an animation that switches from one to the other, so that way we actually get to see it being pushed down or something. But that'll again depend on what we do when we get there. As well, then this has a box collider called isTrigger that covers basically where the red part of the button is. And then the 3 objects here have just normal box colliders for collision's sake, and then everything is on the environment layer so that we can jump off it, and all of that sort of stuff. So now let's get into code and show how this is actually working. So on our button 1 script, first we have all these public variables that we just looked at, as well as a hidden in inspector public variable. So basically private, sort of. We can't see it in the inspector, but it's public for other scripts to be able to access it. A Boolean called press, that is whether or not this button has been pressed or not. So then in start, we're setting press to false. And then just to make sure that the right objects are enabled or disabled for the button, we're setting the pressed object to, oh, this should be, this is slightly backwards, the unpressed object to, yeah, the unpressed object to true, and then the pressed object to false. Yep. And then, then we have a function here called onTriggerEnter, which is when we enter the trigger of the button that we saw in the inspector. So first we're testing if the button isn't already pressed, because this is a button that gets pressed once and we don't want it to be pressed, like the pressed function to be activated multiple times. And then we're testing if the thing that we collided with is the player. Then yes, we hit a button, or the player hit this button, so we should activate whatever the button is supposed to activate. And then how we're doing that is through this array of objects to activate. We're going through each one, and then we'll get to this part in a second, but this part here, we're then testing if this thing that we need to activate has a moving object script on it, so it's a moving object that we're activating. Then we are getting that component reference and setting .enabled to true, so then we're activating that moving platform to move. And then here we'll look at in a second is being used for the multi button, as we'll see in a second. This is also then left open so that we could have multiple if statements for if a button can activate different things than a moving platform. It'll just test if this thing that we're activating has this script on it, do this. If it has a different script, do this. Like maybe you could activate something that like triggers a cutscene or something like that. Then we just have different if statements for those different clauses in here. And then yeah, after we finished activating everything we need to activate, then we are setting the unpressed object to false and then the pressed object to true, and then the fact that this is pressed to true, so that this part of the script only runs once. So that runs our once buttons. Then for the multi buttons that activate more than one thing, or it needs more than one button to be pressed to activate, in this case, a door. Here we basically are getting a reference to this button multi-script that's up here that we'll look at in just a second. And then in the same way that we just did with the moving object script, we're getting a reference to a button multi-script and then running a function on it called activate that we'll look at right now. So in this script, button multi, actually we're going to look at it in the inspector first to show how it's actually being used. So these child objects these child objects of these buttons operate the exact same as the button once script does. Just in this case, the object that's activating is this multi-button parent, and that's mainly for organization. This doesn't necessarily need to be a parent of these. That's just kind of keep them all together, I guess. So each of these three buttons is the same. They activate the multi-button parent script thing, and then on the this multi-button script, we then have an integer amount for the number of buttons that need to be pressed for this parent object to activate something, and then the same objects to activate sort of thing for the moving platform that we had with the button single. So script-wise, we then have these public variables that we just saw, and then this public void, or this public function called activate that we saw that the button once thing activates if it has a reference to, if it needs to activate a button multi-script. Yeah. So when this is activated, then this button's needed, we subtract one from it, and then we test if the buttons needed is now 0 because we've pressed all the buttons that we need to press. Then it does the same thing as we just saw in the button one script, where it's then going through, and then in this case it's just testing for a moving object script and setting that to true, because we're not really gonna ever have a case where setting a button multi-script to dealing with a button multi-script, we're not going to have another clause of having this button multi thing. It's not going to activate another button multi thing. That would just kind of be redundant. Yeah, but any other cases, like there could be other things we add to be tested with, but we'll deal with that when that actually becomes necessary. So next, onto our button timed. Again, it's the same button, and also just different colored bases, just so to kind of tell them apart for now. And they were just kind of colored randomly. And then I made the pressed version of the button yellow, just, I don't know, because eventually we could also have an effect where it's like flashing two different colors or something to show that it's only temporary, and then have it, as time runs out, it starts switching faster or something. maybe. Yeah, so that's just that design choices there. But again, yeah, we'd probably do more stuff with actual like sound effects of hearing like a ticking sound that slowly gets faster and faster, or having like a clock on screen, or whatever it is that we have that shows that it's an actual timed thing. Anywho, yeah, so then this has an active time float that is, you know, how long the button's actually activated before it gets unpressed. And then the same objects to activate. You'll notice that a lot of what's on the buttons is similar. I just didn't want to make one gigantic script with like button types, because I felt like this was just easier to be less confusing. Yeah, and like it's okay to sometimes have some repeated code. I guess this isn't too repeated. It's like different enough. It's just yeah, a bit unnecessary to try overly complicated things where it could then be confusing to understand later. Also, for the sake of these videos, I am trying to use simpler things where I can, just to easier explain things. Yeah, anyway, so then we have the objects to activate here in the same way, and then the same unpressed object and pressed object as well. And then, yeah, code-wise, over here, so then we have what we just saw, and the same hidden inspector but public boolean of whether this is pressed. Then a lot of this kind of is the same, but this time instead, on trigger enter, if we've entered, or if this button can be pressed because the player has hit it and it's not already pressed, then we are starting a coroutine called activate to be able to have delays. Yeah, and then a lot of the stuff here is, well, similar. So we do the same, setting the unpressed object to false and then the pressed object to true, and then setting the boolean of yes, this button is pressed to true, and then going through and activating each thing to be activated. I also, again, actually one thing first. So here we, okay, over on the once script, because we're getting a reference to the this get component moving object thing like twice, I just left it in here like this. But over on the time script, because we're getting a reference to it like 3 times, I decided to just temporarily make a variable, use the get component thing, and then have this set of 3 uses of it, just because that's probably better for optimization and all that. But for it being used twice, and also on something that's only called rarely, because we're not going to be having like loads of buttons in a level, at least I don't think so. Yeah, it's fine to just use get component a few times there, but here just being a bit more optimized. Anyway, so yeah, so we're going through and activating every thing to be activated. I'm also assuming here that we're not going to have a button timed be used with the button multi. And if I would probably make a separate type of button for that, because otherwise this would probably make something where you press, let's say, 3 buttons, but then after the first one gets unpressed, everything would stop. I'd probably have to make a new thing to make like pressing 3 buttons, once all of them have pressed, they all stay pressed or something. But again, I don't know how often if I'm gonna be using that sort of thing in the game. I'm making a lot of these like generic things that I'm pretty sure I'm going to be using in the game, but I don't want to make too specific stuff for it to then not be used. A lot of that stuff we can make when we get to actually we know we're going to be using it in actual levels. Anywho, so yeah, so here then we get a reference to the moving object script, test if it exists, and then like in the same way we did before, and then here we're setting moving object dot reverse to false, and then moving object dot enable to true. This is where that reverse thing comes into play. So over on our moving object script that we made several videos ago, so now we have this public boolean called reverse, and how that's being used is basically if it's set to true, instead of the moving object moving from point 0 to point 1 to point 2, etc., it's going to start at point 2 and move to point 1 to point 0. It's going to move in the opposite direction, basically. So that's how the door going back into place is being done, by just setting it going to its last point, so that it's open, and then setting reverse to true, and then activating moving platform again, so that it's moving from its last position to its first position, which is in this closed position. So yeah, that's basically how that's being done. But then down here we have some cases where, so here when we enable the moving object script, normally we set the current target to 0. Here we're setting it to, if reverse is true, setting it to the current target. We're setting the current target to the number of targets dot length -1 to get that last target. then somewhere down here, wherever, mainly where current target is involved. So yeah, down here we have where we would get the next target. So first down here we have what we normally had before, where we add 1 to the current target, and then if the current target has reached the last target, so it's greater than targets.length minus 1, then if repeat is true, then we're setting current target to 0 so that it loops back around. Otherwise, we're setting it to false. That's what we normally did. Now, if reverse is true, we're doing the exact opposite, where we're subtracting 1 from the current target. And then if the current target is now less than 0, then if repeat is true, then we're setting it back to the top to then go to the last target again, so then it would loop. Otherwise, we're setting it to false. So that's how this is being used. You'll also notice here we have a new function called, it's a public void next target that then starts this coroutine. This is so that other objects can call the wait to move function to automatically make it go to the next target, as we'll see in a moment when we get to the weighted button. So now, so after doing all this, activating the button, setting reverse to false to make sure that it's moving in the right direction, which is from the first target to the last. Then we are waiting our delay of how long the button should be active for the whole timer. Then now that the timer has been up, then we can now undo everything to have the door go back into place. So then we do the exact same thing, where going through our objects activate. Same thing with the moving platform. If we now have a moving platform to move, then we're setting moving object at reverse to true, so it'll go in the opposite direction. But then we're still setting enable to true, because now we're activating the moving object again to just move in the other direction. And then here we're doing the exact opposite of what we did up here, where we're setting the unpressed object to true, the pressed object to false, and then the fact that this button is pressed to false, so that it can be pressed again now. So yeah. Now onto the weighted button. First going into Unity to show how it looks over here. So now we have this blue based button, I guess. And now the script here looks identical to the button once. Yeah, so there's that. Going into then the actual code, again, the public variables are the same with the objects to move and the pressed object. And then a public boolean called pressed, or hidden inspector one, yep. So then start being the exact same of just setting pressed to false, this to true. Oh, and again, yeah, this was kind of missing. There we go. So, yeah, then we have an onTrigger enter function and an onTrigger exit function, where this onTrigger enter function is functioning mostly the same, but then also making sure reverse is set to false, because down here we're going to be setting it to true. Yeah, so this is basically the same as we saw in the button one script. Then in this onTrigger exit function, so when we're on the button, now that we're on the button and the door is moved, if we leave the button, then we're going to be running this. First, we're testing if the button is currently pressed, and the thing that just left us was the player. Then going through each object to activate, and then in this case, we're also assuming that we're not going to have a multi-button with the weighted button. Again, if a scenario comes up where we actually decide to do that, for example, if we decide to hold down some buttons with like crates that you push onto the button, and then you hold down one with the player, and now that all the buttons are pressed, they all stay down or something, we can make that happen, I guess. But we'll deal with that if we actually decide that we're going to do that in a level, trying to avoid making things that we never use, basically. But I'm confident that like these basic types of buttons will be used at least once in the game. So yeah. Yeah, so then we're getting a reference to the moving objects, and then if, yeah, we have a reference to this moving object, then we're setting reverse to true, and then we're doing a special thing here where so we have to test whether or not the moving object script is currently enabled, because if the door started moving, if it reaches the end of it being at the top of I'm doing gestures with my hands even though you can't see them. Okay, if the door reaches the top of where it is moving up to and now it's stopped, the moving object's enabled script is going to be false. So then it's not going to be like moving, it's going to be false. So we're going to want to re-enable it, which is going to automatically start it getting its next target so that it moves back down towards in its closed position. If it's in the middle of moving up, then the script is going to still be enabled. So then if we try to enable it again, even though it's already enabled, it's not going to do anything, which means it's going to wait until it reaches the top and then see, oh, reversed is true now, so, and then it's going to move back down, which is not what we want. We want to, if it's moving up, as soon as we let go of this button, then it's going to immediately start moving back down. So yeah, that's why we're doing what we're about to do here, which is testing if the object is enabled, then we're going to be calling manually this next target script so that even though it's in the middle of moving to a target, it's going to get the next one and then see that reversed is true. So it's going to start moving back the other way. Otherwise, then we're just setting it to true and it's going to do what it normally did with our time button for disabling it there. So, and then we're also assuming with the time button that we don't need to do all that, because by the time that this button is being unpressed, that the door is going to be in its final position. Yeah, so there's that. And then we're doing the same thing down here of setting unpressed to true, pressed to false. Yeah, and the pressed object to false as well, which is then completely undoing the button being pressed, so then we can press it again. So that is all of that. Just some basic button types. There's also a lot more that we can do with this now, in terms of moving objects, and also not just these doors. We could have like a series of moving platforms that are moving up and down or left to right, and then hitting one button activates all of them. In an actual level, we'd have buttons be more separate, not just buttons right in front of doors. That was just, for testing. We'd probably have like a button like on the other side of an area. You have to press it to then be able to continue or something. As well, we could then have more fancy like camera work where you press a button and the camera like pans over to the door now opening, and then it pans back to the player. But again, we deal with that more when we actually get there. We could also make buttons where like only the cube can press it or only the sphere can press it. But again, we'll like do that sort of stuff when we get there, if we know for sure that we're going to do that, because I don't really know if I'm necessarily going to do that, because just having like one player have to hold down one button while the other player is able to go seems to work enough just fine. Because rather than just have a button that can only be pressed by one character or the other, it might be just better game design or level design to just have like, to be able to get to this button that anyone can hit, you have to use an ability that like only the sphere has, like the lunge thing to get across a huge gap, or use the cube's wall jump to like wall jump up walls to get to a button, and that just might be better designed to do in general. So yeah, anyways, that is all that. So that'll be it for this episode. No idea what I'll do next time. Again, just making more level stuff. Soon I might start to get into making enemies, but I don't know if that'll be next time or not. We'll see. But anyways, that'll do it for this episode. Thank you all so much for watching, and as always, I'll see you around.